Hey listeners, I love making this podcast, and I think it's important work. I love sharing these conversations with you, but it takes time and money to make it happen. I need your help to keep making it and bringing you these conversations. Would you consider supporting this podcast with a monthly donation? Monthly supporters will receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits through Patreon. You can go to the website, wdtatpodcast.com, and click on support to make a donation or sign up for the Patreon. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your support. In this episode, I talked to my good friend Gary Goodson about our hard conversations over the years, what makes it hard to have conversations these days. We also work on starting a new religion, but we're still looking for a name, so please send us your suggestions. Welcome to the podcast where we talk about things we're not supposed to, learn how to have difficult conversations, and talk to people about what makes them different. This is the We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land podcast, where we do talk about that with me, Lucas Land.
It's never the right place or time. It's imperceptible to the eye. It's never the right place or time.
My guest today is a longtime friend of the show. Longtime friend of me, Gary Goodson. We attended Texas Lutheran University together many, many years ago. Over the years, Gary and I have had lots of really interesting conversations, and since this podcast is about having difficult conversations and talking about how do we talk about things that are hard, and I thought it would be a great excuse to talk to my friend Gary. So welcome, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So you and I both kind of went back through some of the email conversations we've had over the years, and you sent me a message that said you found around more than 150 email threads, which probably added up to over 500 emails that we've had, not counting Facebook conversations and the dreaded Google Wave episode where we decided to try and have conversations over a failed Google product. So yeah, we've been having these kind of conversations off and on for a long time. And what's interesting to me too is, you and I have been friends for a long time. We were good friends all throughout college. You are the son of a Lutheran pastor.
Yeah,
put that out there because that will come back later maybe as an interesting note. And towards the end of our time in undergrad, we were both involved in starting this group called Students for Social and Economic Equality, which I don't ever think really went anywhere. But
yeah, I think it only lasted.
We were very much on the same page about a whole lot of things, I think. So it's interesting that, over the years, you and I then found ourselves having these conversations where we were on different sides of different issues. And I found this one quote I went back and looked at our emails, and that I thought was really kind of telling. And this is probably from way back in 2010 when we really had started doing email conversations. And it was around questions about how we were talking to each other, I think. And you said that questioning fundamental assumptions about life, the universe, and everything gets heated fast. And you talked about you and your wife, Robin, worked with the Peace Corps in Turkmenistan. And you said that when you got back, you had to basically stop having conversations with a friend because it got so heated. It was difficult to talk about the kinds of things that you and I were talking about. And you said, it gets heated not from personal attacks, but from the very nature of the conversation. You said, just remember the conversation is about ideas. And by the way, the answer to everything is always 42. And maybe it's that nerd bent that we share that also always kind of kept us going. So I thought the first thing that we could talk about was just this, kind of trip down memory lane that you and I have both taken. What were some of the things as you were reading back through the email conversations we've had that you noticed?
Well, I think it was like definitely early on, especially when we were tackling the topics of science and religion and how they interrelate. It seemed a lot like we were talking past each other, I guess, a lot, and sort of feeling out where each other were. But then in the later conversations, especially when we were getting more specific on our topics, it seemed that it was a lot more congenial. We were both sort of really kind of asking more questions, I guess, instead of telling each other what was going on. And those conversations seemed to be much more productive than the early ones. And that was one of the things that stuck out to me from looking over some of those 150 threads.
I also noticed that even maybe in the earlier threads, we often apologized to each other. I noticed sometimes where you said, I think what I said might have come off really like short or insulting in some way, and I didn't mean it that way. And we kind of tone policed ourselves a little bit, that we were pretty careful about knowing that it was difficult conversations, that they were, as the quote I read, that they can get easily really heated because these are sometimes issues that are really close and really personal to people.
Oh yeah, exactly. And there was one, I can't remember the exact, it was me, and I don't know why I did this, but I came out strong, like swinging for some reason. and then of course, when I read your response, I was like, well, yeah, I'm not surprised you responded that way. But I think I think I probably apologized, and it was like, and backed up whatever it was that I said. But I was just really surprised that I had, considering that when I read that email, by that time we'd had plenty of conversation going back and forth. And for some reason that email, I don't know what was going on that day. I decided to come out swinging. So, but I think over time, I think the doing that tone police thing that you were saying, I think over time we learned probably how to like engage each other better, so that we didn't have to apologize as much later on, or maybe apologize before we even said it, being like, don't take this wrong, this is just me.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see the evolution, because I remember during those early conversations we had, I remember feeling probably like I had a lot to prove. Like you mentioned that a lot of our conversations were about science versus faith. And so I was going to seminary and in some sense, pretty invested in what I was doing should matter, right? I wouldn't want somebody to come along and disprove what I was investing all my time in. And maybe just being younger, I felt like I had something to prove, or I needed to make good arguments for why was this thing I was investing a lot of time in so worthwhile. It obviously was meaningful to me, and I needed to defend that, but that comes with a certain like baggage when you're coming into a conversation with something to prove in some ways, and you could definitely tell that I think in some of those earlier conversations.
On the flip side, I think around the same time I had just discovered skepticism and the new atheists, so I was definitely also doing a similar thing, because I was reading a lot of those guys, and listening of course to the Skeptic's Guide to the Universe, just to name drop them real fast. But and so it was the same thing for me. I was learning all this new stuff. Sort of a new world was opening up, and I was like, I gotta go out there and spread this. Not thinking about my strategy of spreading it, of course, and then just to prove it.
And I also noticed that even though you and I maybe early on were kind of zealous a little bit about our particular side of the conversation, it was still about the ideas. And I think that's probably what both of us enjoyed about those conversations. And, it does make it easier that you and I had a long relationship and already had a friendship, and we weren't, this wasn't the start of our friendship trying to argue about science versus faith, right?
Exactly. Yeah, I think that helped too.
Yeah. I also...
I was just going to say, when I was thinking, I think you were asked, like, in some of the email conversations wanted us to explore how we were able to have these conversations. And I think a lot of it had to do with we had that strong foundation before we started it. So in some senses, our relationship was more important to us than proving each other wrong or beating each other down, intellectually.
Yeah.
I think that definitely helped.
And I mean, yeah, that is kind of a question I have. I mean, we are still good friends and have remained good friends through all of these different conversations that you and I have had over the years. And what is it? I mean, maybe it's just that you and I are kind of compatible. I mean, there's lots of friends, I think, in life that you have that you just get along really well with, and you could have kind of an argument with, and maybe that's all that it is. But I don't know. What do you think? Why can we have this conversation that, for example, you couldn't have with this friend when you came back from Turkmenistan?
Yeah, I wish I could remember. I have to go back and look at the email that I can't remember. I remember saying that. I just can't remember who it was that I had that conversation with. But I think,
someone else that you can't really talk to the way that you and I kind of have the back and forth.
Well, I mean, for us, going through college where our relationship sort of developed in an environment where challenging ideas was sort of the thing, right? That's what you were supposed to do in college is challenge ideas, and we both understood that the other respected that, and that's so our relationship sort of, I think, developed around that, and we sort of knew where each other was coming from. So I think for new friends, if you're developing them now, it's like it's sort of it can be, you were valuing developing that relationship more than sort of like challenging them on maybe alternative medicine, if that's what for me anyways, if they're spouting alternative medicine, I'll have to be, I don't want to like insult them by being like, oh, you're crazy. I can't really believe that, especially if I'm, developing that relationship. And I think it just takes time to sort of feel it out. I'm sure when we first started out, we probably were very, not that we were walking on too careful, but we probably were careful around each other at the very beginning, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah. Although probably becoming friends in college, that's kind of this time in life where like you were saying, that's the thing you do, right? It's an environment where you're kicking around ideas and challenging each other and, asking questions and all of that kind of stuff. So, I mean, it could be that we just, we became friends in that kind of environment and didn't have to go through. I could imagine trying to become friends with somebody now, and if they bring up similar topics, then I'm going to be a lot more slow to feel out, okay, where are they at? And how do I talk about things without just setting them off or something like that? Whereas you and I have a history, and there's a lot less to wade through or to worry about. We can kind of just jump in.
And I'm not afraid, like, if I say something that you're going to take it so personally that you're going to be like, hang up on me and walk away or something. Where with a newer relationship, that might not be, until you get there. I mean, if you develop it and nurture it, at some point you could get there, I'm guessing. But it does kind of speak to the importance of having people, I guess, in your life and relationships that you do nurture, that are worth kind of developing. If people don't have those kinds of relationships, where could you find people that would be willing to have those kinds of conversations where you might find somebody that you could build that kind of relationship with? Because I found it so valuable. So many of the conversations you and I have had over the years have been the conversation or the things that I have been thinking about, as I got into sustainable agriculture and different aspects of sustainability, some of those kinds of things, which people glom on lots of things like anti-vaxxers or alternative medicine you mentioned, that all kind of, sometimes it gets all thrown into the same pot. The people that I was around a lot of times saw sustainability, sustainable agriculture, all mixed in with all of these other things. It's kind of all went together. And you and I got to have you as a sounding board to think through those ideas and talk about them. And it made me better. It made me smarter, made me think through things
in a deeper way. And I think we all need that in our lives, especially as we're more and more polarized,
exactly.
right?
I don't know how you would, developing those, getting to that point. I know it's we have another mutual friend who's a lot more on the conservative spectrum, and it was always interesting talking with him because it was a similar thing with you where I would, it's where you and I differed more on the science religion side. With him, it was more on the political sort of social side, and those conversations always were interesting, but they also stayed simple. But like he was another relationship that developed in college. I don't know. I feel like it would be somewhat difficult to develop that same trust, I guess. That's the word we haven't used yet, but trust in the relationship to get to the point where you could have that conversation, especially, as you mentioned, as polarized as it is. And even now I'm trying to think of any newer relationships I have where, we just don't reach that level of, on topics where we disagree strongly, we don't reach that level of conversation. I don't think that you and I had on those emails.
Yeah. Also, during that time was when Facebook and social media was kind of new and developing, and now it's kind of everywhere. And that's where we're having a lot of those conversations with people. And I really don't like blaming social media for our conversations personally. But I do see how it affects us, and affects the ways that we have conversations. Facebook tends to not be our email threads back and forth. When you go back and look at them, are long responses to each other. We would go point by point sometimes and give long explanations of our rebuttal or our thoughts challenging what the other had said. And that doesn't work very well on Facebook. So I wonder if that's also a part of why the kinds of conversations you and I had are harder to have now.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're onto something like that. I mean, I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I don't want to blame Facebook or Twitter or social media either, but it seems like those platforms, it's much easier just to sound off or sort of, I guess, display what you're thinking, but not necessarily engage. And most people don't seem to want to engage. They just want to either validate the post or sort of have something kind of quippy real fast about it that they disagree with. I mean, I know early on I tried to engage, and it just didn't work. None of the conversations really went anywhere. And I remember a few times when I started tempering the way I, asking questions or trying to feel out what people think, people would come back kind of insulting, and I'm like, okay, I guess clearly you don't want to have this conversation. And it's,
yeah,
I don't even really try anymore. I'll get on and sort of say a few things, but it just doesn't seem worth it because it doesn't seem like you're right. That doesn't seem the correct platform for that those types of conversations.
Yeah,
especially Twitter. Twitter is just terrible.
Yeah, the limit of characters on Twitter, I think, is probably what I've never been very active on Twitter, and I think that's part of the reason is the limitation of characters for me makes it feel like something else, and I kind of feel like, well, I don't know, it doesn't seem worth people. I see these Twitter threads of people having these multiple 140 character, or I guess it's 280 now. I don't really know.
Yeah.
Multiple posts of Twitter to be able to try and make a point or have a longer argument. And it seems kind of almost silly to me that, why do it that way? Why not just, at least on Facebook, you can have a longer post and have points and have it be longer, and people, if they want to read it, they can. Yeah. This idea of engagement, though, I think is really important because we do. I mean, I think people think that they are engaging while they're on social media, but I think what you and I are saying is the kind of engagement we had back and forth, very thoughtful, asking each other questions, really trying to wrestle with some of the ideas that we disagreed on. What you're saying is that's not how people are engaging on Facebook. And sometimes if you attempt to engage in that way, it gets met with a lot of resistance. Yeah. One thing that I have done, though, on Facebook is try to find ways to engage. And it is really difficult, particularly with some of my family or friends who have very different, mostly political positions than me, trying to ask them questions. And I do want to say it is possible, just because like I said, we try to blame the platform or social media, but we also are the ones that decide how to use it. And I don't know, maybe it's Russian trolls that are really causing it to be used the way that it is. And I could be totally wrong, but I do think that we can use it in a different way, but it does take a lot of effort. And sometimes we have to carve out a space. Like I'm a moderator for my seminary's alumni group, and I try really hard for that to be a space where the conversation on Facebook is different. But it takes effort, and that still doesn't always work very well.
No, I think you're exactly right. Like carving out, I guess I don't want to say safe space, but that's sort of what it is to, where people can know they're not going to be trolled if they bring up, controversial opinions or topics. You're right. It does take a lot of work to engage somebody at those levels. So I've seen some of your Facebook posts on that, and on other friends who have similar family members or friends who are very opinionated, and it's interesting to watch, because usually, because they are family or I guess close friends, usually you'll see that it will start up pretty heated, but then by the end of the 10 comment thread, there's everybody's saying, yeah, way to go, we agree on that, and then they move on. So I'm not sure what whether or not there was something productive at that point, or if they just agree to disagree at that point. But at least they've had the conversation, it seems, and then moved on.
Yeah, I think we want to carve out niches that are quote unquote safe spaces, and you don't like that term either, which I'm not a huge fan of that term. But carving out a niche where we can have better conversations, and I think what happens is then we often end up in echo chambers where all the people who agree with us, we need a safe space, or we need this group where we can have these conversations, and then it ends up being, aren't those people ridiculous that don't agree with us? And what I enjoy about our relationship and our conversations over the years has been, it's not safe because you're very willing to question my ideas or my assumptions about things that I believe or whatever, but so it's not safe because everything's on the table for discussion. In that sense, it's not safe, but it is a place where I know that we can ask those questions of each other, challenge each other, and try to have a robust conversation, not trolling each other or what seems to happen a lot on social media.
Yeah, exactly.
So one thing I wanted to ask you, I would like to do an entire episode maybe sometime on cognitive biases, because that has been a really helpful tool, learning about the human brain, the ways that we trick ourselves. And so maybe another time we could do that. But I wonder, so just to continue our conversation, I wanted to see where are we at now on science versus faith? I mean, have we? I saw at one point in our conversation that I joked about us starting a new religion or something, and that we were gonna work on a manifesto for that. So I don't know if we're at the point where now you and I can write a manifesto for our new religion.
Maybe I think we'd have to start up the conversation again and. I guess so. I mean, personally,
well, we can have that now. What is our first point of doctrine, Gary? What's our first rule of the new faith that we're creating? Faith, science, faith.
Is it a science faith?
Well, I don't know what it is.
I don't know. I think
we haven't named it yet.
We haven't named it yet. No, I think and what I was just about to say, one of the later things I said, I think I said something about, I don't have a problem with anybody's like believing what they want to believe, as long as they're not hurting themselves. So if they are doing something and it makes them happy, it makes them, makes their life fulfilling, then there's no, I don't have a problem with that. And I don't know if that's I mean, that sounds, I don't know. It could be a foundation to start at, sort of respecting each other's belief systems,
Mm-hmm.
that you don't need to tear them down just for the heck of it.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I'd also want to put in critical thinking, especially if it's going to have a science bent.
Yeah.
Skepticism.
I do think, I will say that on my side, the faith side, we still are not real good at encouraging critical thinking or upholding it as like a example of good faith, right? That we think critically about our faith, or we engage it in a way that's in some ways skeptical. And I understand that's kind of, I mean, some people will probably hear that have faith of some kind and say, well, faith is faith. Like, why would you think critically about it? It's supposed to be belief, right? You're supposed to take something on faith. But engaging in the things that we do believe, whether that is science or faith, critically, makes a huge difference in how we respond to other people. I think you're exactly right, because that critical thinking and then that skepticism, but also sort of like learning, as you mentioned earlier about the cognitive biases, it's sort of a humbling thing to learn about, because then you realize that most of your beliefs are probably based on possibly false assumptions, or things you think you remember are probably not true. So it makes your approach to what other people believe and what other people may be saying or thinking, you want to ask questions instead of telling them, how to think at that point, because you want to figure out what they're thinking, and then so instead of engaging or debating the person, which isn't really productive, you sort of try to figure out, where they're coming from, but learning how to critically think and thinking skeptically is part of, it helps to learn how to do that. Yeah, I think that's what worked really well in a lot of our conversations as I was rereading them, that we would often mirror back to each other what the other person was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember doing this entirely intentionally, but some people call it like the praise sandwich or the Oreo method, where it's often used in business, where you have to write a difficult email to like an employee, and you got to praise them first, and then you say the hard thing about how they're not doing their job right, and then you praise them at the end, and then that way it's a little easier to swallow something difficult. Yeah. But another way, I feel like you and I did this well, is where sometimes we would reflect back, like, I hear you saying this, and I agree with you on this point. You and I agree on X, but here's where I think maybe we differ, or I have a question about what you mean by that, or something like that. And so we were constantly having this back and forth where we would find common ground, or we would find ways that at least we understood what each other was saying, and could say, I agree, or I don't agree, and here's why. But I think throughout, what made it work really well is that both of us felt heard. And then when we didn't feel heard, we usually would take the time to say, yeah, I don't think you're understanding what I'm trying to say. And then we would try to explain it more. And we both assumed the other was honestly trying to understand what the other was saying.
Yeah, and we reinforced it by, you sort of touched on it when you were talking about the Oreo sandwich, but like when we restate stuff, being like, did I hear you? I mean, it's all writing, of course, but like, is this what you meant? Before rebutting sometimes, or as you said, like, we agree here, but it's, I think part of that was, being heard, and restating sort of reinforces that, right? If I'm taking your idea seriously because I'm thinking about them and I think this is what I heard, can you, verify that? And then responding, instead of just assuming that you understand completely what the other person is saying.
Yeah. And I'll reiterate, I think, what both of us have said, that because of a long-term relationship and the like maybe thousands of emails, I don't really know and don't want to count, it all takes time, Those early days when you and I were probably, I remember feeling, if I think about it now, getting an email from you and reading it, I would feel sort of urgency to respond, to kind of set you straight or explain my side.
Yeah, no.
It took us both probably a long time to get from there to where we are now, where I think those whatever conversation you and I have now or in the future would be a lot more laid back and a lot less heated.
Yeah, I can definitely.
Time is a big factor.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can definitely agree with that. I think I also felt the same sort of anxiety to get on and respond as fast as possible, even if I did write like 5 pages of a response or something, which I'm sure happened.
Yeah.
And I even remember, I mean, like you had kids before me, but like after my child was born and we were still having these long email debates. And when I was looking back at it recently, I was like, how did I find time to do that? Like, or maybe it was just I had too much time because I did spend the first year at home. So maybe I had enough time to sort of really contemplate that while I was changing diapers and whatnot. But
yeah, I feel like I can distinctly remember having a baby sleeping on me and like typing on a laptop, responding to you. Yeah, seems like probably what was happening.
Oh yeah, but yeah, it does take time, but we got there eventually.
Okay, so we need more points of doctrine for the new religion that you and I are working on founding. Critical thinking and skepticism. Time. I'm going to add time. Yeah, I think time. It takes time to develop good, healthy, critical thinking, skepticism, and relationships where you can have these conversations.
Yeah. Do you want to put relationships down there?
Oh, yeah, relationships, sure. Definitely. Yeah, and maybe for people that, sometimes I think people probably think it's fun to start over, maybe if you're an extrovert especially, meeting new people, and that's always exciting, and I'm sort of half of an extrovert. But when you have the shortcuts that you and I have, man, it's so beneficial. And it's worth the time, I think, that you and I put in to be able to have those conversations and not have to worry, right?
Yeah. No, yeah, exactly. So relationships, time, critical thinking,
skepticism, questions. I mean, it kind of goes along with critical thinking and skepticism.
Questions, yeah.
But I remember one of the first times you recommended Skeptic's Guide to the Universe podcast, and I think the first time I listened to it, my response was something about how it's really good, but they come off as arrogant or something like that, and maybe because they were kind of the other side of the conversation from me a little bit or something. I don't know what it was. Sometimes there can be critical thinking and skepticism, but it's done in a way that asks questions that aren't generous. Maybe that's another point, that the questions should be generous and not intended to defeat your opponent, maybe. Curious, right? Generous and curious.
Yeah. No, I think that's a fair point. There was, who Phil Plait is, the astronomer? Maybe not.
No.
He had a pretty scathing rebuke for the skeptic community about 10 years ago, and I think his catchphrase when he gave a speech at a conference was something like "Don't be a." Just but it was going to what you were saying, like don't be arrogant, don't try to tear people down, try to build those relationships, try to question, and find out where they're coming from. I think that there's definitely some in the skeptic community that I've heard it on some of the podcasts that where they definitely do come off as arrogant, but I think the SGU has tempered themselves quite a bit. I think since their beginning, though, they'll talk about being humble sometimes now, and trying to be inclusive with people with religious backgrounds, because that's not their mission is not to get rid of religion. Their mission is to spread critical thinking and skepticism. So
yeah. I didn't expect that we were going to be starting our new religion on this episode, but since we are, we're just going to keep going
on this episode. Yeah, I didn't either. So it's
well, I mean, the nice thing about starting a new religion is that you and I get to be at the top, we're like the popes of the new religion. So it's pretty awesome.
That's right.
Yeah, it makes sense to me that those that are in the skeptic community, in the atheist, agnostic community, would fall prey to the same problems that fundamentalists have. It makes sense that as human beings, when we are advocating for things, we're not always nice about it, right? Mm-hmm. And we can be real jerks about what other people believe. I think that's it seems to me like it's a fine line that somehow you and I have found to walk, which is why kind of I wanted to talk to you.
Yeah.
Where a lot of times when we're engaging, we're those zealous evangelists for whatever our cause is, whether that's Christianity or whatever your faith is, or that's skepticism or atheism or whatever, finding ways to engage. I don't know what I'm trying to say. I think what I'm struggling with is how fundamentalists and those who want to advocate for skepticism maybe, but are just jerks about it, kind of end up in the same boat, right? Where nobody wants to be around those people.
Yeah. It's, I would probably say a skeptic who's like being too big of a jerk is probably not really practicing skepticism at a productive level. And you probably say the same thing about religious fundamentalists are probably not practicing their religion at a practical level either. But it's, when you learn about going back to the mind and how people believe and what they believe, and once you learn that it's nearly impossible to change somebody's mind, especially if you're just throwing facts, what you think are facts at them, then that's just not a way to like engage somebody or to develop a relationship with somebody. So you really do have to like take a step back, and even if you're trying to change their mind, you got to start with, why do you believe that? What's, if you're talking to somebody who maybe is an anti-vaxxer, mm-hmm. You don't bombard them with facts. You sort of try to figure out why they believe what they believe, and sort of slowly, introduce things, or, ask why they believe that, and see if you can sort of steer them one way or the other. But that's a longer approach. And maybe, mm-hmm. It's a more loving approach, because you're treating them like a human being and not like an object to be refuted, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, that's helpful, right? Like treating people as human beings, and that's what gets lost when we are so zealous about our side that we begin to dehumanize or treat people or talk about people on the other side as if they are just somehow they just don't make sense, and it could be because they don't make sense to us. Mm-hmm. Why people believe certain things. I did an episode on nonviolent communication, and one of the basic premises of nonviolent communication is that the way that people behave, or the way that they talk, or maybe even, as I'm talking to you, maybe even the ideas that people subscribe to sometimes mm-hmm. are based in our basic human needs, mm-hmm. right? There's a reason why people believe different things.
Yeah.
And we could decide whether or not that's a healthy reason, or it's good, or even true, maybe in the end, but recognizing that it comes from something that we actually share with people.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, like, back to the anti-vaxxers. Well, I mean, their primary concern is the health of their kids, right? And they're trying to make a benefit risk analysis about whether or not they should vaccinate their child, and we can all relate with that. I mean, we can relate with the loving the child and the risk benefit analysis of making decisions about what to do with your child. So if you start there, then you don't feel like attacking them. You feel like trying to figure out what's going on.
Right. Yeah, and then you can affirm that. Mm-hmm. Like, yeah, I want to take care of my kids too and make the best decisions, and it's kind of a crazy world, and it's hard to make those decisions in this world, mm-hmm. right? I still have lots of conversations with my wife, who she does lots of reading on different things, and she's been the one that's been at home with our kids. And so she's always the one reading up on different things. Mm-hmm. And so sometimes she comes to me with things that I think are out of left field and I might be really skeptical about, but I've also done zero research and she's done all the research. So I have to, if I want to like talk to her about it and say that I disagree, well, I need to do my homework too and try and understand it. Yeah, she's trying to figure out. And when I've had those conversations with her, I've often been aware of how difficult that is. You know, if you just go online and try and search whatever, I mean, vaccinations is one example, but it could be, you know, what are we supposed to be feeding our kids, or what are we supposed to be, what's the best thing to be doing developmentally or with school, or I don't know, so many different things. It's easy to get completely swamped and overloaded. As wonderful and beautiful as the internet is, it also is, it provides a space for anyone and everyone to share their thoughts and opinions. And there are vetting processes for certain journals or things like that, but we're so inundated with the information that it becomes really difficult. And I think part of what happens is that information overload leads us to find something to cling on to, you know?
Yeah, I think
whether it's like the keto diet or anti-vaxxers or something, like we could grab onto it and be like, okay, like these are my people now, you know?
No, that's true. That they reinforce, you know, but it's the same with any group, but they'll reinforce each other with their preferred sources and preferred websites. And I think in some ways you hit upon maybe one reason that some of these online forums don't work is because, and it's not so much that people are in their echo chambers, that they have their echo chamber, they bring their echo chamber into the Facebook conversation. And in order for you to refute that, you have to spend 2 hours doing research on whatever ideas, you know, has been brought in, and trying to figure out who is reputable, who is a good source, because you may have never encountered that idea before, and that can be kind of exhausting, actually, to try and engage every idea that's coming out there, because it just takes too long to be. You can't be an expert in everything. So, and some of the groups pretend to be experts in those things, so you feel like you have to at least do a little bit of research to figure out what's going on.
Right. Yeah. I feel like that happens so often on issues on Facebook where I do try to do a little research and find something that I hope is in some ways neutral, or, you know, not from kind of a organization that's got a specific agenda, but find good resources. But it seems like it quickly devolves into, I hear this all the time. Well, you can find anything to support your side, right? You can find any study, you can find any statistic to support your side. And then we just we don't trust anything. There's a really good podcast. I don't know if you're aware of this podcast by Michael Lewis, and I'm totally forgetting the name, but the premise is about referees in our common life. Against the Rules with Michael Lewis. That's what it's called.
I'm sorry, what was it called?
Against the Rules with Michael Lewis. He's the guy that wrote The Big Short, and he wrote the book on Moneyball about the Oakland A's.
Yeah.
And this podcast is looking at the different ways that we used to have referees that would tell us whether something was true or not, or, you know, judges. He has one episode about the art world and how deciding what is a real piece of art or fake, especially from like masters, you know, when this new painting surfaces, sometimes there's a question of its authenticity. Who is deciding whether or not it's authentic, and how we used to trust the referees in all those different areas of our life. And now we don't trust the referees. And so it's really hard to have conversations when there's no one to appeal to. There's no referee. There's no source where you can say, yeah, but this neutral third party, you know, Walter Cronkite said X. And then everybody goes, oh, well, you know, if Walter Cronkite said it, then we kind of all trust Walter Cronkite. There's nobody like that anymore.
Yeah, no, you're exactly right. There's no the trust in, I guess, the authority figures or the experts in their fields, whether it be journalism or science or medicine or even politics for that matter. Nobody, they're just not there anymore. So you can't appeal to them. You have to. It's tough to figure out how to solve that though, because everybody wants to. I mean, I've heard stories about people going to their doctor. Or you hear about don't Google your symptoms. Just go to your doctor and talk to them. But nobody trusts that anymore. They do Google their symptoms, but that's an incredibly unhealthy thing to do. Mm-hmm. But that's what we want to do because we want to. I mean, in one hand, it gives us control, but like as you said, though, the referees aren't there anymore, and it makes it's definitely polarizing and makes conversation and discussion difficult if you can't point to an expert and say, we can talk about climate change and how the scientific consensus is that it's happening and that it's man-made, but we have to talk about the 3% of scientists who disagree and they get 50% of the coverage or more. I think I just saw an article today saying they get more of the coverage. So it's like, how do you navigate that?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and I feel like that might be a whole another episode just to talk about how when we disagree. How do we, if we're able to have the conversation, how do we start to find the truth, or how do we even navigate this world that we live in when no matter what I bring up, if someone already doesn't agree with me, they'll have kind of things in the wings waiting to discount whatever I say, and there's almost no way to have that conversation. So what could we do, or how would we? What are the rules? What are referees that we still have that we can use? Are there any? If there aren't, then how do we even move forward, or how do we have conversations where there aren't referees? I don't know the answer to that, and it's a little bit unsettling to think about. Actually,
it is unsettling. I would say, I mean, there's still referees in the wings. They just not quite as influential as they used to be. And I guess you just have to do the hard work of, I guess if you meet somebody who's a climate denier and you value changing their mind, I guess you just have to do the hard work of taking the time. It could be years of like slowly changing their mind or helping them accept the evidence of it. But doing that without I don't know how you would do that though, because like you said, they might just reject everything you bring forward every time. So I mean,
well, I will say that one. Oh, go ahead.
I was going to say that, and just to balance it out, there's also individuals on the left who do a similar thing with their sacred cows. So
right, exactly, yeah. I do want to say that I think there is a value, and you and I are an example of this, of having conversations with people. For example, if you don't agree on climate change, you might need to let go of the idea of convincing them about climate change. As you said before, facts don't work to change people's minds because we don't all agree on what the facts are. You and I might share some standards about what makes facts, but there are people who don't agree with that and have whole systems of logic and understanding that don't agree with that. I think what I want to say is that there is a value in having the conversation with somebody, not in order to change their mind, but to keep the communication open, because it makes it possible. It makes it much more possible for us to change our mind when we don't see the other side as the enemy, or we don't see them as, foaming at the mouth crazy people, right? Like we were talking about earlier, finding ways to humanize them and see the needs that they have. People, if we only have those conversations where we throw up our hands and say, I mean, those people, they just can't be convinced, and why even bother talking to them? It continues to only reinforce the sides and make it less and less possible for us to have conversations that change our mind. And maybe those people aren't open to those conversations yet, but they're not going to be as long as they continue to have the view of the other side as just trolls who won't listen to them and don't respect them and don't care and don't see them as human beings. Nobody's going to listen when you're in that sort of space. So if nothing else, you can create that space for somebody to be more open to asking questions about their belief.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I would agree with that, definitely.
Just based on the fact that you treated them like a human being.
Oh, yeah,
right?
definitely. Like if they care, then they're going to be more open to sharing, but also to listening, probably, once they've said their piece. So, and maybe you might not convince them, but if like you said, that's not your goal really, but if you can plant the seed, maybe because they're at a space where they're actually listening to you because you've treated them like a human, then maybe you won't change their mind, but at least maybe they'll give it thought and due consideration instead of just ignoring you or rejecting it outright.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good time to start wrapping up. I like to wrap up with 3 things, something that we learned maybe through our conversation, something we can do or we can recommend that people do, and then something that we can share with people that's a resource or a recommendation that we can give. And I'll go first so you have some time to think. I've learned a lot over the years just talking to you, but I think I'm reminded, looking back through our conversations, that especially that the journey is long. And we were all young and idealistic once, and hot-headed maybe, and that we grow through those kinds of relationships and engagement that are really good and really healthy. And I'm thankful for having that relationship with you. And it teaches me, I think, that you keep engaging even as I get older and think I've kind of got more things figured out, that I want to keep growing, keep engaging, and keep learning. And I need people like you in my life that I can have those conversations with. Something that we can do, even though I really hate blaming social media, I think we can recommend people going offline and having conversations about important things with people. You and I have had good conversations face to face that I remember fondly, even though they were still intense conversations that I can recall. And if you can't have a conversation face to face, Gary and I are testimony that you can do it over email. You can do it longer form and more thoughtful and slow. At one point in the years of conversation we had, we intentionally, I think this was your suggestion, because we had busier lives and were having kids and whatnot, you suggested let's only respond to each other once a week. Sundays would be the day that you could respond, and then the other person would take a week to respond. And we slowed the conversation way down, but it forced both of us to be more thoughtful in how we responded. And so it's possible, and it's worth the time that it takes. And the last thing, something that I want to recommend, is a book that you and I read together. You recommended to me many years ago, and we read it together and discussed it together, by Michael Shermer, called The Believing Brain. We mentioned cognitive biases, and that book has lots of really good and interesting information about our brains and what our brains believe and the ways that our brain can trick us. And I highly recommend that book by Michael Shermer, The Believing Brain. So Gary, what are your 3 things? Something we learned, something we could do, and something you can share as a recommendation.
So something I learned, I mean, just also I appreciate our conversations that we had. And I think the thing that I learned is from those conversations is how to have these conversations. I mean, it helped that, like, as you said, we were good friends, and we had a place where we could sort of throw these ideas off each other. But I think, and as I described earlier, by reading over those emails, I could see how we both sort of learned to have the conversation and be less heated about it and sort of really engage and start to engage more with it. And I think if we hadn't had those conversations, I don't think I would be in a place where I could listen more or, be more empathetic of people's other positions. So I think that's what I learned through all those conversations. For doing, I think I'm going to go to the internet again and just encourage people to follow news sources or follow, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, famous people that they don't agree with, just so they can follow sources you don't agree with, just so you can see what the other side is thinking, and really sort of try to engage with the ideas on your own. Because I think doing that helps a lot, because you sort of relax, you take a step back, and if you see it from their point of view, you're better able to engage your own ideas, because then you can change your beliefs in accordance with what they're saying about them. So it makes your beliefs stronger, but it also helps you to understand where they're coming from. And the last thing, what I recommend, being a librarian, is I'm just going to say, go to your local library, where you can find The Believing Brain and probably other books, and just read a lot, and read outside of your genre, read outside of your comfort zone, read different things. Again, sort of piggybacking off what to do with finding other sources online. Because the more you read, the more you will have that sort of different perspective on things.
Yeah, awesome. I love that recommendation, especially as we have news on our phones. I notice Google News, I still look at it almost every day just to see what kind of the top things are. But Google also is tailoring the news to me all the time. And all these algorithms that are being used by Facebook and all of the different apps that we use are often reinforcing our behaviors. They're reinforcing the kinds of stories or news that we already are viewing, right? Or they're recommending that we follow accounts on Twitter that we already agree with, because they're like other accounts that we agree with. So it really does, like you said, it puts the onus on us to seek out people we don't agree with, and seek out news sources that we don't agree with, and put in a little bit more effort. It is hard because it's a lot easier to market things to people when you can just sort of steer them to their happy place, and then hopefully they'll click on something, right? And that'll fund your app and put more money in the pocket of Twitter and Google. But it doesn't help us have better conversations, and that's the sad part. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, and one tip I can give is that on Twitter allows you to have lists. Mm-hmm. Their algorithms don't affect the list, as far as I can tell. It just gives you a straight chronological feed. So
yeah, create
a news list, add contrarian sources to it, and you'll be able to, you'll get those in your feed, and we'll give you, it's not like Twitter's main feed, which, as you said, it's the algorithm that's feeding you what things you want to see. But
do you have, Gary, a contrarian Twitter list?
I do have a news list, and it does contain several conservative Twitter feeds on it, so that I can occasionally pick up one of their articles and read it and see what they're saying. I would say 80 to 90% of the time I'm not agreeing with it, but occasionally I find myself thinking, okay, I see where you're coming from.
Yeah. Great. So make a Twitter list, or find somebody that has a Twitter list that they could share with you.
Yeah.
Of what they're reading,
Mm-hmm.
Great. Gary, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. And it's always good to talk to you, and I'm excited. Hopefully we can maybe talk more about cognitive biases, or how to talk in a world without referees, or something else another time. But I appreciate you, and thanks for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a good time.
Thanks for joining us today on We Don't Talk About That with Lucas Land. If you like what you hear, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss any episodes. Help us spread the word by sharing it on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram with the handle @WDTAT Podcast. You can also rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. You can support the podcast by visiting our website at wdtatpodcast.com and clicking on Support. You can make a one-time donation or consider becoming a monthly supporter through Patreon. You'll receive bonus content and access to patron-only benefits. Thanks for your support. We would love to hear from you. Leave us a voicemail by going to our website and clicking Send Voicemail. Your voicemail could be featured in a future episode. You can also email us at wdtatpodcast@gmail.com. Many thanks to Neil Curran and Infielder for the use of their music. You can find more of their music online at infielder.bandcamp.com. A final thought from Brené Brown. The willingness to show up changes us. It makes us a little braver each time. Until next time, keep showing up and keep being brave.
What are you gonna do?